So Jamie, Wayne, and I are presenting today on the provision of services. And the learning outcomes, upon completion, we hope that all of you will be able to, number one, become familiar with the requirements of consumer service provision through the individualized plan for employment, the IPE process. And number two, learn the required steps to extend and amend the consumer individualized plan for employment. And number three, understand the importance of correct case note documentation in the provision of vocational rehabilitation services. And to emphasize on this third outcome, really a reminder that every single VR process really requires a case note. And so we're hoping that that you are providing that to us to your clients. I'm sorry, I'm doing more than one thing at a time, and can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Whoops, I went backwards here. Okay, so what we have here in this slide is, hold on. So what we're looking at in this provision of services is prior to collecting signatures on the IPE and according to your AIVRS program policy, the VR counselor and the program director will consult with one another on the consumer's vocational goals to address the consumer's barriers to employment, such as VR services and vendors, comparable services and benefits, the beginning and ending dates of services, method to assess and evaluate the consumer's progress, responsibility of the AIVRS program and third-party service providers, and when everyone is in agreement, signatures will be acquired for the provision of VR services. Really, it's think about everything that when we were talking about in the first week in July when Wayne, Jamie and I were presenting the IPE and Paula presenting the IPE, we're just reviewing all of the steps right here that needs to really be taken into consideration as you're looking at that provision of services. So the short and long-term responsibilities of a VR counselor after an IPE is signed. You retain the original IPE in the consumer's file. You provide the consumer and/or representative a copy of the IPE and a copy of the consumer's rights and responsibilities. They should have that as well. You want to provide a formal annual review of the IPE with the AIVRS consumers. And that doesn't mean that you cannot amend the IPE before the annual review. If it's necessary and the consumer requested or the VR counselor requested, an amendment is made to the IPE before the annual formal review. And then at the time of the annual review, you want to assess the consumer's progress in achieving an employment goal, right? And amend the IPE if needed. So the document must, the annual review in the case record with periodic reviews and case notes. If you look at the way that the process works, each process is so similar. There are still the same requirements for each process when you're looking at the application, the eligibility, the development of the IPE, and the implementation of the IPE. You're always, you get a rhythm and you're providing the same steps so that after a while it becomes natural. It's like brushing your teeth, right? So now we're looking at, an IPE amendment. How does that work? An IPE amendment may occur at any time after the IPE has been finalized and approved, anytime. That is something that is important to know, because life doesn't happen linear. It's circular. Things happen in between and all the time. So you need to be flexible and help your consumer at all the time and be ready to look at making that amendment. So some of the circumstances that may appear, such as the consumer's employment goal may change, the AIVRS services to be provided may need to be revised, vendor for the identified service may need to add one. Somebody may, a vendor may have dropped out and a new vendor is required. Like the extension of an IPE with completion dates, change in cost for consumer services, change in status of the case, or change in the consumer's disability and condition. So you're looking at, these are the issues and the circumstances that we're looking at continually through every process that we do. But now that you're in that agreement stage where there's a signature and that signature agrees that you're going to do things, you need to make sure that if at any time something is interrupted, that it's documented appropriately, whether it's through an amendment and it's through an IP and it's through case notes. I heard somebody wants to chat.
Oh, that was just me, Suzanne. I was agreeing with you. I said, and I forgot that my.
Woo! That's great. I'm glad we're on the same page. And
I do want to add, though, while we're talking about this, about services and service dates and all that, sometimes I think when you write the IPE, you're listing the services to be provided, and depending on the service dates, the beginning and end, you may not have a vendor identified right at the beginning of the IPE development.
True.
And then, as you get closer to the service date, you may change vendors, add a different vendor. But I think it's really important that you have a meeting with your consumer and the vendor, because it is the consumer's right. And, we're informed choice is always being implemented. So they sometimes may need to meet the vendors depending on the service to make sure that they want to work with that individual or with that company or with that service provider. So I just wanted to add that in real quick.
Okay. And before I turn the talking points over to Wayne, does anybody have any comments that they want to make on the first couple of slides here? Are there things that we may have missed? Are there things that you would like to expand on, or questions that you want to ask now? Chat box.
This is Paula.
Hi, Paula. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. I think on your other slide, it talked about annual reviews, and I think that just again to mention that some programs, that's the minimum to do an annual review. And so some programs do that, quarterly, monthly, just to maintain contact with the consumer and to review their cases more often. So I just wanted to make that.
And this is the slide Paula is talking about at the time, annual reviews. And thank you for that, Paula. That and that demonstrates that you're really staying on top of it. I know one of the things when I was doing VR counseling services, the case file would be open and the document that I'd be working from is the IPE. So it's reviewed every time. Once the IPE is developed, it was reviewed every time a consumer came into the program.
So
Okay,
Suzanne,
wait.
there's a chat box here. Let me jump in here.
Yes.
Ethel posted in here that, so when we tell them to provide 3 estimates, so do we add this to the IPE and let them know that the least expense cost will be approved? That's more of a standard operating procedure. It's not a requirement for the IPE. We do require 3, you know, and it goes back to your policy, your program policy, and what level you set your guidelines at as far as needing three quotes or 3 estimates, and that's not included in the IPE. The only thing you have to include in the IPE is the cost that you end up using, or the item, for the item that you purchase or the service that you purchase. Hope that clarifies that for you. Okay, so it looks like I'm up.
Wayne?
Yes, you are.
Cool.
I hear a little noise in the background.
For me?
Yeah, Wayne, this is all. You know, we are told that we need to start putting the cost in there. So do we go ahead and put the least amount or the highest amount, or just the amount that's going to be approved?
When you're looking for a cost, if you don't know the exact cost, like tuition, sometimes you'll put in 4 years tuition, and you'll use the first semester's tuition to calculate the 4 years of tuition, and maybe it changes in the 3rd or 2nd year. That's one of those things where you would put in that estimated cost. You have a base cost, and that's what you calculate it off of, knowing that it might go up or down in the next couple years. Now, if you're providing a service directly, let's say it's a gas voucher or a bus pass or training equipment, you should have from the quotes or the estimates that you get an exact cost. And when you do that, you want to put that exact cost of the item that you're purchasing. So if it's the least, because we always want to go with the least expensive, or the one that meets the consumer's needs, not wants, but what's required to remove a barrier, right? So that language has to be there. Then you use that amount.
Wayne, if I can comment, this is Paula. Ethel, there's going to be some pre-IPE planning. We generally don't do IPEs like in one day sitting in front of the consumer.
Exactly.
We collect all our information, and so we're doing that pre-IPE planning by getting, if your tribe requires, your procurement policies with your tribe requires 3 estimates, for example, or your program policies requires 3 estimates, then that's pre-IPE planning. So you would get those estimates, you would select the one that you're going to use, and you would put those costs within the IPE. So I hope that clarifies that you're going to be doing some pre-IPE planning ahead of time, so that you can get actual costs.
Right. Good. Thanks. Wayne, there's a couple of people in the chat you may want to look at, Angelina and Rachel.
Right. So Angelina puts in here that there should be a cap in the grant. There should be a cap per consumer. Yes, there is an amount that is spent per consumer. That's in the notification when you're doing your application. Rachel states that it should be documented that the annual review has been done. I've seen VRCs not have it documented, say it's been done, but it needs to be documented in the file. Some do it on their IPE itself and initial that it was done. So yes, that's very accurate. And that's part of what we were talking about with the case record and case management earlier, is that it has to be documented. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. So we always want to make sure that we document, and some programs create a form that just says annual review completed on this date, no changes needed, and then the VRC signs it, and then maybe if the program wants or needs, they have the director initial it. And again, sometimes it's just a narrative case note. We completed the annual review today, and da 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 da. So the annual review, since we're on this topic, one thing I wanted to cover is that it doesn't require the presence of the consumer. You can complete an annual review on your own as a VR counselor. The client or the consumer needs to be present if you make changes and do an amendment to the IPE. The annual review is just some document or a step that the VR counselor can do to document that we've looked at the case, we're on top of it, we're making sure we're following through with the steps of the case. So a lot of people get confused between completing an amendment to an IPE and doing an annual review of an IPE.
Wayne, I want to get back, this is Paula again. I want to get back to Angelina's comment about cap per client.
Yes.
When you do your budget, your grant application budget, yes, you can, identify how you came up with your budget for consumer services, but you're not supposed to be putting caps on client services, from my understanding. Like one client may, their IPE may be $5,000. Another consumer may have, $15,000. So if you go with comparable benefits as well, then the service cost might be lower. So I just wanted to make those comments, because you can't put caps on client services, because each individual is different. Each of their disabilities is different. Each of their circumstances is different.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paula. And one of the things that I use as an example is that take a clothing allowance. You can't have a policy and procedure that says clothing allowance $500 per consumer, when one consumer may only need $50 and another one may need $300, depending on the employment situation that they are seeking. So thank you for clarifying that, Paula. Somebody else wanted to step in there.
That's me again, Suzanne, agreeing with you. Sorry.
That's okay. So, okay, Wayne.
All right, we got a couple more in the chat box here.
Yes.
Wayne says not only do we get 3 estimates, we have to make sure that the vendor is willing to be set up as a vendor for our tribe as well. That is an issue a lot of times that we see. There's some, discrepancies and stuff like that are taking place between the tribe and other vendors in the community. So you got to make sure that they're willing to work with you. Anita says once a vendor is approved and a cost is approved, then include in the IP not to exceed and then the amount that was approved. Any cost beyond the approved amount is responsibility of the consumer to pay. Again, as what Paula was saying, we got to be careful with some of that stuff. When you're talking to a vendor, you can use that language not to exceed, but we can't tell the client that we can only provide this much service. We can have a discussion about, and it really comes down to language, right? So we can have a discussion about what amount they're going to participate with and what we're going to pay. So it goes back to that give and take in that negotiation period that is before the IPE development. So that when we get to that point, we all have an understanding of where we're at. Rachel's got on here on that cap, that's an average. RSA does not want us to put definitive caps per case. Right. So exactly what Paula was saying, she's supporting that.
And it looks like you can take the
so
next slide.
All right. So when we get into amending the IPE, so this is the part where I was just talking about between annual review and IPE. We sit down with the consumer. There's a change of some sort. In the previous slide, Suzanne gave some examples of that. One of the things that we have to make sure and do is provide the opportunity for informed choice. A lot of times at this step, sometimes informed choice gets left in the dust. And we got to remember that they still have every right to make a decision, to go out and do the research and make that really rounded decision for their case. Once that's done and everybody's in agreement, the VR counselor needs to provide a copy of the amended IPE to the consumer or their authorized representative. retain the original copy in the IPE case, and we move forward. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Any amendment to the IPE must provide an opportunity for the consumer to exercise informed choice, like we were just talking about. And it's not just in service providers or service provision. It's also the employment goal, beginning and ending dates, methods of how to procure it, all of that, and comparable benefits. All of that is included in that informed choice decision-making process. We need to provide a copy of the amended IPE to the consumer, retain the original copy of the approved IPE amendment, and then document it in the case notes for the date and the purpose of the IPE amendment. So again, this is where we start that paper trail where we follow along and show everybody the story that's unfolding for the case file. The goal of provision of consumer services is to provide services that are equally accessible across the service area. So whether it's on reservation, off reservation, off service area, on service area, whatever definition you're using in your grant, we need to make sure that it's equally accessible across all of it. Services as needed to assist consumer in achieving their employment goal. So again, we go back to that, what's required to remove barriers for employment, not what the consumer wants or thinks they need. It's what's required to remove that barrier to employment. We need to always examine the need for changes to services. As we progress through it, sometimes disabilities improve, disability characteristics improve or become bigger barriers. So we need to always be willing to adjust the need as we go through it. Again, diagnosis and/or treatment of impairment. So sometimes with co-occurring disabilities, we have new stuff come up, and we have to figure out how to work around it, help them adjust to it, that type of thing. Complete required assessments, provide job search, job placement, on-the-job supports as needed. So on-the-job supports, it's different than supported employment. So, and we don't want to confuse that. On-the-job supports is maybe going in and doing some training, talking to the supervisor and helping them develop some natural supports in the workplace. We provide counseling and guidance throughout the VR services case. So from beginning to end, that's the first service that should be listed on everybody's IPE. We provide, that's the main thing that we provide, is that counseling and guidance service. And when we are documenting counseling and guidance, we got to remember that it's above and beyond the normal session. So if you have somebody that comes in, you guys talk about employment opportunities, that's a normal VR session. That's not a counseling and guidance session. But if they come in and they're talking about why the impairments are blocking their employment, and you guys talk about adjustment to disability, overcoming barriers, adapting, that's a counseling and guidance case note, and you would note that as a counseling and guidance case note.
And sometimes, Wayne, the guidance and counseling may come into play when there's an interruption in services. It doesn't mean that you have to excommunicate this individual because they're not receiving services at this time. So we don't want to leave people hanging out to dry. And many of you are on the front line right now through COVID-19, and you're doing everything possible to communicate with your consumers. And the provision of services are perhaps being interrupted. Thanks for letting me interrupt there.
Yeah, and counseling guidance can be across the case. It doesn't have, it can be at the beginning, the end, the middle. It doesn't matter. It's one of the services that is available at any time.
This is
You're
Paula.
gonna say something, Paula?
Yeah, I think that, just to add on, I think we always emphasize in training, and as we work with our staff in professional development, is that counseling and guidance needs to be included on every IPE. And so it's important to look at the case notes to make sure that counseling and guidance is being documented, as Wayne had mentioned. So it's important to also have some counseling goals in your, when you're talking to your consumers. So I guess basically what I'm saying is don't just put counseling and guidance on all your IPEs and not show the counseling and guidance reflected in your case notes as to how you're working with your consumers.
Good point.
I agree with you, Paula. I think this specifically, counseling and guidance, is an area that documentation is so very important. You really need to describe the service, how it was provided, and keep case notes when you're providing this particular service. Thank you for reminding folks about that.
All right. And then it's, any employment goods or services, required vocational training or other services as needed. So it's a long list. It all goes back to that comprehensive assessment and developing the IPE, the negotiation process, and the exploration of job goals, employment goals, to get an idea of what services are required to gain employment. So we got a list of some examples here of activities and resources and forms. So when you list your services, you want to be specific. You want to talk about counseling and guidance, traditional healing services, training, transfer, etc. Those types of things. The one thing I want to remind everybody is I get a lot of questions about the traditional healing. When we talk about traditional healing, we don't have to identify the ceremony. I want to make that very clear. We don't have to identify the ceremonies. We have to put down that we're providing traditional healing services as a service on the IPE when we utilize that service category. In your case note, you don't have to identify the ceremony either, but you need to discuss what barriers are being addressed. And this has been a long discussed kind of sticking point with reporting. We don't have to give up our ceremonies. We don't have to talk about it. We just have to talk about what's being removed and how it's helping the person. There's go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry to disturb. This is Melissa Vicente. When we do, I'm from the Navajo Nation's OSERS, and when I do the services with the native healing, I usually mention to the consumer that it needs to tie into their VR goal. And usually when I discuss that with them, I document it in the progress notes. So that's kind of how I do it. And I also, I know it's not mandatory, but I try to have them write a little statement of how it's helping them. So whoever reads it, or if it gets audited, then it came from the consumer of how that native healing is helping them. So that's another way I do my services in that area. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you. There's intake to post-employment PDFs. We're working on a what do you call that thing, Jamie? Like a roadmap or flow chart?
Well, I call that, when we talk about removing roadblocks to employment, I always use the analogy of having a roadmap to employment. So that's kind of my little description of the VR services and how we map out the plan for the consumer.
Authorization of services, so again, your program policy and procedure documents, you can have some forms that show authorization of services. Again, depending on your policy and procedure, whatever your limit is that requires supervisory approval, your amendments show that. Then there's non-allowable costs and closure for non-employment reasons. So these are just some examples of different forms and things that you can show the provision of services and track it in your case file. And again, the number one thing that's going to track all these things is your case notes, your case record. You start at the beginning and you just show the story of that client's, or that consumer's journey through VR and how we're removing barriers to get into employment. And that's going to be your key to service provision for people if you're on vacation, or if your supervisor needs to look at it, if there's appeal, if there's anything like that. The case record is what's going to support you in that process.
And if I may interject here, a lot of times if you're looking at, when you're writing your case notes, you have policy and procedures, and in your policy and procedures, you have language. You have the VR language. Be sure that you review your policy and procedure and make sure that the language is in your case note. This way you're always, even if you have fillable forms or any, like your eligibility form or whatever forms that you may have that has making your steps easier to make sure that you're getting all the information required, you still are required to write a case note. It demonstrates that you are aware of the individual's impediment to employment, and you're using the language that goes along with our discipline of vocational rehabilitation. Thank you, Wayne.
And I want to add right here on this particular slide, these are examples. If you go to our website, we will have the VR process page completed, and all of these resources will be available in a toolbox for you. So for example, if you want to just look at our PDF of the intake to post-employment webinar, that'll be available. There are lots of question and answer information there. Also, there will be materials on IPE amendment, specifically what that is, how it's conducted, what I call a cheat sheet on non-allowable costs, so that you can see what those are specifically. And also there'll be material on the closure for non-employment reasons that will specifically describe different types of closures. So this list here is actually resources, documents, templates that we've created in case you need to take that material and create your own material from that. So we're trying to make everything a template for you to use for your program.
There's an important chat from Rachel. Do you want to check that out?
Okay. Yeah. So I was just gonna jump in and talk about this, because this is a huge point.
Yep.
There's Rachel put in here. Can you speak to the balance of not including every little detail but capturing the pertinent info? So this is the standard. Do I write a novel, or do I write just an abstract? And so we got to really have to pare it down to just the meat and potatoes of the note. Take out all the thought, or all of our objective thoughts, or no, subjective thoughts, whatever thought. Just kick out our thoughts. Only have observations in there and the facts that are happening within the case note. And we really want to show, what the next steps are. So we capture what is happening without delving into the story, writing a novel. We want to tell the chapter without having to do the whole book. So when I train people, I talk about like SOAP notes, subjective, objective analysis and plan, and we adapt that to VR, or DAP notes, and we adapt that to the VR approach. So you just capture what you talk about, what the result was, and what the next steps are, and you want to be able to look at the note and say, okay, I know if a stranger picked up the case note, they could read 3 or 4 notes and know what the next steps are, where you're at and where you're going. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you, Wayne.
This is Paula, and I think that's the reason why I had suggested earlier to have some counseling goals, because you can summarize, and that's the whole part of it, is summarizing what took place based on your counseling goal. And so you don't have to put every detail in there. But I appreciate your comments, Rachel, because yeah, it can be a balancing act.
And just in response, or just to let everybody know that there's a link now in the chat box to some of our materials that are being developed.
And just to remind everyone, we really need your input on the survey at the end of this webinar, at the end of all of our webinars, actually, because that's how we finish developing materials and resources, by taking your input and what you need and how to apply it. So please, at the end of this webinar, if you could give us some input on the materials, we would appreciate that.
And if there's no more questions, I'm going to kick this over to Jamie now.
Thanks, Wayne. Suzanne, are you working with PowerPoint?
I am. I thought I moved it already. I'm sorry. I fell asleep at the wheel.
So we worked on a checklist for provision of services, and here are some of the things that we feel like when you are completing the IPE, you want to make sure that these things are definitely included in the IPE. The start date and the completion date of services need to be in the IPE when it's first completed and ready for the consumer to sign. Some programs verify economic need. I come from state VR, so economic need was always a part of the IPE development. But I do understand that some programs do not require that. So if your program does, you need to definitely do a financial statement or any type of economic needs statement if you are required to do so. And of course, we always want to maintain contact with the consumer. It's so easy sometimes to get busy with all your cases and then you haven't made contact. I always try to make it my own personal goal to be in contact with the consumer at least every 60 to 90 days. Some consumers you're in contact with daily, but there are some that you're not, and it's easy to lose contact with them. And also we need to make sure that the consumer actively participates in their services so that they're making consistent progress towards their employment goals. And it's easy for the consumer to kind of slip away, you know, and you put services in place and we try to convey to them their responsibilities as far as their VR services and their employment goals. So, you know, just make sure that they are continuing to actively participate. We don't want to be paying a vendor for services and the consumer's not showing up for appointments and things like that. And the exploration of comparable benefits, there's a whole list of things here, you know, Medicaid, Medicare, Pell Grants, any types of scholarships, any type of private medical insurance, the VA. We have a lot of consumers that receive services through the Veterans Administration. That's definitely a comparable benefit we want to include. And then you may have a consumer, not often, but sometimes you may have a consumer that's receiving workers' compensation benefits or services. So these are just, you know, a very small window of different types of comparable benefits, but we want to always be thinking about that when we're developing the IPE. And then case notes. I can't say how important it is to document. I think I used to have a paper on my wall that said document, document, document. And, you know, sometimes we feel like we're writing case notes continuously, day in, day out. But documentation is so very important, especially when you get to this part of the VR process, the provision of services. And we always want to make sure that we're documenting informed choice to meet that requirement. So I like to make sure there's a document in the beginning, during the middle of the case, and at the end of the case. You always want to make sure we're documenting informed choice. Also, good documentation of the expected outcomes of the goods or services that are being provided. You know, sometimes we make assumptions, and sometimes the consumer may be confused on what exactly it is that they're supposed to be receiving through VR services. So always having a good description of exactly what the case is going to be included as far as VR services and what outcomes are going to be expected. And that's part of the responsibility of the consumer and of the VR counselor. And of course, IP amendments, if there's any changes, if anything's deleted, completed, discontinued. Sometimes you need to change your service dates, you know, service may end earlier than anticipated. You want to go ahead and close that on out, especially if you're using a computerized billing or any type of computerized invoicing. So making sure that you have your end dates in there correctly or changed. And then, of course, any authorization policy that you may have in your program as far as authorizing payments to a vendor. You want to make sure that those things are done and completed through your authorization or invoicing system. So now we're at the point where we're going to ask some questions. Does anyone have questions? Can we discuss some things? I think Angela was going to share with us some information that she uses. Angela, are you there?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Hi, good morning from Anchorage. We've just basically made it easier since we're working remotely to create fillable PDF forms. These range from the application, the referral form, ROIs. Of course, the IPE, we would be meeting with a consumer over the phone, what they would like to pursue as a one vocational goal. We do have a fillable IPE worksheet where the consumer can identify, you know, what it is they want to pursue, what services they will need, what is their contribution. Yeah, that's just really kind of like a nutshell.
Thanks, Angelina. I appreciate that input. So yes, fillable documents are wonderful if you have the capability to do that. Once we have the VR process webpage complete, we will have templates for a lot of the things that you mentioned, the application, the ROIs, the what we call a RAP, which is the Written Rehabilitation Analysis page, kind of a pre-IPE development form. Of course, the IPE template and case note templates and we'll have examples also of different types of case notes. So once we have this webpage completed, you'll be able to go there to the toolkit and download a lot of these templates and forms to create and make your own program so that you can put your logo and your program name and specific information to your program into these templates. So thank you for sharing that, Angelina.
There is a chat. You want to take care of that last chat? It talks about, do you recommend we do an amendment if the case is closed before the anticipated closure date?
This
I think there.
This is Paula. She's one of my staff.
Okay.
So I was emailing her private. I mean, chatting with her privately. But anyway, if what I had put is I think what she's saying is that, okay, the case closure date is July 30th, and the consumer is not going to be employed for 90 days until December 30th. So yes, you would do an amendment to extend the date to December 30th, you know, to take care of that. So because you're changing the employment date in your original IPE, you would do an amendment to extend it.
Okay, so yeah, I responded to that, Paula. I was thinking that the case was closing prior to
Right.
the expected closure date. So sorry I answered that thinking in that mindset, not what you just explained.
Yeah, and I was along the same line as you, Wayne.
Myself as well. I thought it was due to early closure prior to employment. And thanks, Paula, for explaining that.
But also, I want to thank, I can't pronounce her name, I'm sorry, I'm so bad with language. Somebody help me, but want to thank for the question, because that is a really good question. As we look at it, as we look at the IPE journey and getting toward closure, there are many different, like I said earlier, it just doesn't go from A to Z. It may go to A to E, and then it might go, then skip a couple and go to M and continue on. It's quite a beautiful journey, and we need to be able to recognize that we're paying attention to all the needs, whatever the consumer is asking, that we're paying attention to that and that we're responding appropriately. We're having some more conversation.
Before we get off of that, I'm glad you did clarify that, Wayne and Jamie. So your employment date for closure is just a projection. So like, let me give a different example. So let's say you put your projected closure date of employment for December 30th of this year, but yet everything is going well with this consumer, and you are ending, you're going to close them on August 30th. No, you don't need an amendment to do that, as Wayne indicated. You don't need an amendment to do that for an early closure. So, you know, I just want to reiterate what Jamie and Wayne had also mentioned. And again, it goes to each program's policies, because Rachel, you might want to read Rachel's comment in the chat box, because it goes back to each program's policies as well.
That's right. And I'm glad Rachel posted that in the chat box, because what she said was that for their program, they have a successful closure and they call that a closing amendment to the IPE if they close early due to employment. But if they have an unsuccessful closure, they call that a notification of case closure. So they are notifying, you know, the consumer at that time, usually by letter. I think you have to have 2 letters, don't you? 2 notifications that they are closing the case. Yeah, the 10th. And thank you for that, Rachel, for providing that information. And we have a question. Angelina says, if a consumer was a successful closure, can we also provide post-employment? Yes, of course. You certainly can provide post-employment after a successful closure. And then Ethel says, does post-employment have to be put in IPE for specific services for approval, or does an amendment have to be done? And I would like to ask Suzanne to answer this, because she's our post-employment specialist.
Well, it looked like Wayne wanted to, so I don't want to. Wayne,
Okay, go ahead, Wayne.
Okay, so with post-employment in this situation, when you develop the IPE, you have to identify that you talk to them about the post-employment services and that it's available. Now, in that situation, when you're developing the IPE, it's at that time you ask that question: are they needed? And 90% of the time it's going to be no, they're not needed. but you still have to address that post-employment question. When after the case has been successfully closed, and the best practice is within 12 months of that case closure, as long as it's connected to the employment goal and it's disability connected as well, and they come in for post-employment services, and it's an appropriate post-employment, then what you would do is you would amend your IPE from the original IPE. And granted, the case is closed, so you have to write a case note saying that this person has come back in and requested post-employment services based on the need and the explained request, and it, you know, being connected to the employment goal and disability connected, we're going to open this case post-employment. And then you would complete an IPE amendment, and you'd identify that service that's being required to maintain or advance their employment. And you would identify it in the IPE, and remember that it's time limited and it's also service limited. So we don't want to have 5 services under post-employment, and we don't want it to last for 6 months under post-employment. If you get into that type of situation, you want to just reopen the case, take a new application, and provide services under a new case. So if it's 1 or 2 services, 30 days to 60 days long, that's what they're talking about under time limited services. So you would identify it in the IPE. I'm going to go back because that was a long rambling answer. So you identify it in the original IPE that you have talked about it. After the case is closed successfully and they come back and request it, you would complete an amendment that captured the service provision that's needed to help them obtain or maintain or advance in their employment.
Right, and it has to be limited in time and services. It can't be complicated. Okay, there are other points in the chat box that look pretty good. I'm trying to find the last one here.
I think we're at Angelina's second question about, she said that RSA requires that the IPE no longer than 24 months, but it is determined by the consumer and the counselor. For example, if a consumer is just wanting to pursue competitive employment, it's usually a year, but if the consumer pursues training, IPE dates can reflect education, employment, etc. So yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so when it comes to dates of an IPE, the true measurement is forward progress. If that individual is still making forward progress towards employment, the IPE can remain open. Now, it does get tricky with our discretionary grants, because what this is talking about is, like, at the end of every year, while we have a 5-year grant in our grant cycle, at the end of every year, there is a potential for funding not to be approved for the next year. So they don't want to have us carry over these long-term IPEs. However, there's a lot of cases where it does. And at the end of 5 years, we have to have that discussion with our consumers that are under IPEs, saying that there is a potential that this isn't going to be refunded. But so for me, I mean, I've had cases that were open for 6-7 years, not just 2 years. And if they were, depending on their needs, sometimes, you know, they're either in training or we're doing active job search or training, on-the-job training type stuff. So, I mean, the longevity of the case is all based on that individualized service provision and need of the consumer, not a number that's just set out here for us to be at the end of it, be like, oh, your time's up, see you later. It's all individualized on that client's need and the ability to show forward progress.
Yes. Thank you, Wayne. Yes, thank you for explaining that. And I think the last comment was from Rachel, and she said basically that was just the name of their form, closing amendment to IPE, which they use for successful closure regardless of if it's early or not. And it's a separate form, not really an amendment. So she said maybe they may consider changing the name of that form. Thanks, Rachel, for that input. So I think we are going to go on to the next slide, talk about our next webinars, unless anyone else has any additional questions or want to talk about any of the service provision information we provided today. If not, let's talk about our upcoming webinars. So a really good one that's coming up August 25th is going to be Holistic Traditional Healing and Tribal VR. That's going to be presented by Dr. Lee Gashioma, our director, and it will
Dr.
be
Darrell and Dr. Darrell Joseph, I believe, is also going to be with Dr. Lee. Mm-hmm.
And then our next step in the VR process is going to be employment or successful closure, and that webinar is going to be held August the 27th. So that week in August, we'll have a webinar on Tuesday and then another one on Thursday. So
We
I
also
think
have
you'll have
one. We also have one coming up on the 18th that we haven't got on the books yet. So be watching for that announcement also.
Okay, thank you so much, Wayne, for that reminder. And again, please fill out the webinar survey. Here's the link, and we'll put the link in the chat box also. We really need your feedback because we're developing materials that are specific to the programs, and we want to make sure that we cover any issues, any questions you may have. So your input and your feedback is very important to us.
So Ethel, I just saw your comment here about the transition VR services information webinar. It'll be on our website. We did a joint presentation with WinTAC that talked about state collaboration. We had a panel of people from the AIVRS programs as well as state VR, and that'll be up on our website, and we can get you a link to go to that also.
I'm having a bit of a problem. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened, but I'm...
All right. Well, thank you all so much. The link again to the survey is in the chat box. We thank everyone for their input and for the wonderful discussion on the topic. And thank you for participating today. We look forward to seeing you again very soon.
So Ethel, we just put up in the chat box the link to the website that has the recordings.
And it's also right here. Oh my God, this is crazy. Crazy, crazy. Is everybody seeing it? I don't know what's going on here.
Nope.
No, hold on. I don't know what's going on. Sorry, can't help I don't know what's happened to the.
Angelina, we haven't had any contact with Eleanor lately, so we don't know what's happened with KNR. Hopefully, if all the travel restrictions get lifted and stuff like that, and the programs can travel, I'm sure they'll have it. Otherwise, we're probably going to be looking next year again.
All right, thanks so much, and everyone have a great afternoon. We appreciate your feedback, and we appreciate your willingness to discuss the topics with everyone, and we look forward to hearing from you again on our next webinar. Thanks. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.